Right. Okay. So this is part of a much larger deck that I will PDF and share at the end of this. But I like that because we're kind of concise on time. We'll just kind of use this as a particular summary slide. Probably like Graham, I'll just go through the UI itself so to have a look at it. So Sentinel. Well, it's a couple of reasons primarily. Key thing is it's taking SIEM solutions away from their traditional space of being on-premise and on-premise driven, and there are limitations with that. And also it leads to, let's say, the administration overhead required to maintain and patch, etc., for that infrastructure, and thinking about storage, etc. So by moving them into the cloud, you obviously then have the benefit of actually being able to focus on what the system is trying to deliver, and basically your job being is looking at security incidents, security events, and identifying particular threats and protecting environments against that. So that first bullet point there about, the key thing here is there's no infrastructure set up, there's no maintenance. So I don't have to think about, what server OS I am, what patching I need to do in it, what version of a database I need to run, etc., etc., etc. It is really just delivered as a service, and as an organization, then people can generally just utilize it as they see fit and need. It will also scale. You also, much like I was saying, you don't need to think about the compute side of things, because the storage side of things, because that's taken care of behind the scenes with Azure itself. Like a lot of Azure services, it's a case of pay for what you use. More importantly, though, is how do I get my data in? And it's utilizing those pre-wired, connectors that are there. On release, I think there was somewhere in the region of about, 20 to 30 connectors. We're now up to something like 90 odd connectors, and the product team have committed to deliver in the region of another 100 by the end of this calendar year. So there's been explosive growth in native connectors, and bringing both native connectors from Microsoft solutions, but equally dealing with third-party solutions and devices, and seeing those as first party, and ensuring that the data is available there. And a majority of cases, that's really, really important. The other thing to think about, the data behind this, is it's both structured and unstructured, but we utilize a fairly standard log format. Everybody's probably familiar with the Windows event log. On the other side of the fence, with regards to Linux and Linux, Unix, network devices, etc., it's either Ceph or syslog devices, or sort of log format. So it's obviously bringing all of that in. One of the key things about the platform as in and of itself is that it, on average, correctly, the ingestion is in the region of 10 petabytes a day. So that's an extreme amount of data that's coming into the Azure form that is then queryable. We can then run things like machine learning models over the top of it, or artificial intelligence. And also it's linked to the threat intelligence. Now, behind the scenes here, and this kind of links to that, those 3 bullet points on the bottom left, on the left-hand side, about the investment that Microsoft made in cybersecurity. But the final bullet point there is thinking about the threat signals. Where are all of those coming from? They're coming from Microsoft's own, managing our own platforms across the globe. This is also coming from, governmental, federal type organizations and third-party providers to feed in that threat signals and those threat intelligence data. And that is utilized across the whole of the Microsoft security stack, whether that be Sentinel in this particular case, or others. And in the next slide, I will just position where Sentinel sits in the bigger picture. With regards to taking that a little bit further forward, there is the option there to bring your own machine learning model. So if you're familiar with Jupyter notebooks and Python and R, etc., you can build those additional, more complex, or even investigative type notebooks to run through that data set, and obviously then do some intelligent actions on the back of that. And essentially that's what the Microsoft SOC or CDOC actually do on a daily basis, is looking at those and looking what we can do there. And in actual fact, the team it's referred to as the Mystic team, which is the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. They actually produce a a number of Python modules that actually can be utilized within those Jupyter notebooks to help through those investigations. Visualization is equally important, and that's just utilizing workbook type capability that's native within Azure itself, whether it be in Azure Monitor or in Sentinel or Log Analytics, if you're familiar with any of those services. The other part of all of this is also being able to visualize a potential attack. And that is essentially looking at the integration between a number of different data sources, regardless of whether they're native Microsoft or third party. It's building that view of the data, the signals, the correlation, the relationship between them, any sort of interdependencies, etc., identifying those. So as an analyst, you can essentially track what that kill chain could potentially look like, even though the data is coming from multiple different sources. Bullet point at the last two bullet points there is, multi-cloud. It's not just Azure. In fact, you can link it through to AWS, GCP, and equally don't dismiss on-prem. It's just as important, or even hosted data centers. Wherever your environments live, you can utilize Sentinel as a management SIEM solution on top of that. The other capability, which I'll talk about a little bit further on, is the SOAR capability, or the orchestrated and automated response. So what do you do, or what can you do in an event of an incident? Some of that actions may be automatically remediated. Some of it may be more of a manual approach based on an analyst's view and knowledge and experience of what they might want to do in a particular scenario. And that actually leverages Azure Logic Apps as a way of running through those workflows, etc. So where does Sentinel sit in the overall picture? Top down. So Sentinel sits at the top, providing the traditional SIEM capability, albeit built in the cloud, native in the cloud, but also looking at the SOAR capability. So again, utilizing Logic Apps to identify that and doing that as part of the orchestration element. As I mentioned, native connectors, building that integration between the wider Microsoft 365 Defender suite. So whether it be Azure Active Directory, Defender for Identity, or Cloud App Security, Endpoint, Ceph, and Syslog, as I've already mentioned, and looking at, across the board, whether you're looking at individual identities, endpoints, your data and email, or even those other cloud applications. And obviously with Cloud App Security, that expands again beyond what natively within the Microsoft stack. Then you look at that cloud and hybrid scenario, and this is where Azure Security Center fits into it. And this is a common question we get between, what's the difference between Security Center and Sentinel? Security Center is there as a cloud workload protection platform, or essentially it's, to boil it down and maybe do it a little bit of a disservice, it's about the security posture of resources that are in Azure and on in a hybrid scenario, and equally extending that beyond the traditional virtual machines or physical servers, but also looking at the services that are in Azure, or even more recently with the IoT side of things with the CyberX acquisition that Microsoft made. At the bottom here, we also talk about, and I kind of alluded to this, is the intelligent security graph, and that's essentially the piece in there where all of these threat signals are enabled and identified and effectively consumed by all of these services. So that is the piece that where all the data is and where the data lives. Third-party data sources, and what you find there is literally just a selection of the common scenarios that you find, or common partners that we find in there. So whether it be Palo Altos, your Cisco's, your Barracudas, your F5s, Qualys for vulnerability assessment, all of those sort of things are there natively out of the box. When we talk about the connectors, and I'll show this in a few minutes when I look at the UI, is they come with a configuration element. How do I get the data in? The rules that I will utilize then to build or analyze the data as it comes in to then potentially trigger an incident. And the visualization element is workbooks, and that is taking that data, running the queries, and actually presenting it in a way that's actually more consumable from a human's perspective. Okay, so thinking about move my mouse. Apologies. couple of things I want to add in. Common question that comes up is, right, this is great, but where can I learn more about it? So from a training perspective, there are a number of webinars and seminars that you can actually look at with some links here. There's the Sentinel Ninja training. This is kind of a level 100 training. It level 400 training. Apology. It starts you at the very basics of where do you start? How do I get it provisioned? How do I get the data enabled? Building it up through to building custom queries, looking at how do I do my threat hunting, moving on then into the sort of the Jupyter Notebook piece I mentioned earlier. Number of different learning paths. So again, on MS Docs, you got through the learn, you can start to look at the core capabilities, basic architecture, and how to get familiar with it. But talking about where we were, what's happening today. In fact, this was announced earlier today. There's actually 4 new certifications that have been announced to sort of close that the gap that's there from a security skills perspective. Now, whether you're going to be running and operating something like Sentinel, for example, then the certified security ops analyst certification might be for you. But then if you're dealing with more on the M365 side of the portfolio, you might want to look at things like the information protection or even the identity and access and the security and compliance and identity fundamentals, and kind of build up there from the ground up. So that's a useful addition to the sort of the training material that we've got. A couple of things that I want to just finish on before I move to the UI itself. And this is a scenario that comes up very often. When you talk about SIEM solutions, organizations by themselves will think about, I need a SIEM solution, therefore I will deploy it, I'll operate it, I'll manage it, etc. But what about if you've got a scenario where, as an organization, you've got multiple, maybe disparate businesses that might have, they want to have the elements of their own autonomy, and they want you from an operations perspective, but actually from a security perspective, you want to centralize all of that. Or maybe you're a partner that wants to deliver an as an MSSP. Here's where you can utilize Azure Lighthouse. Azure Lighthouse is effectively a free service, overlay service, if you want to call it that you can utilize with Azure Sentinel, Azure Log Analytics, Security Center, or even Azure Policy to actually give you a view across both multiple tenants, or in the case of Azure Sentinel, multiple Azure Sentinel environments. So if you're in a scenario where you're thinking about, maybe I want to do, provide MSSP type services, then you have that capability where within the Azure portal, you have a delegated right to your, to a customer's tenant, and therefore then you have the right permissions to actually, maintain and manage and operate that environment through the use of Azure Lighthouse. So finally, I'm not going to go through all of these, but again, I've got a whole bunch of more links about, where you can use the key element in here is probably the third bullet point there in that useful links is Azure Sentinel utilizes a query language called Custom Query Language, or KQL. It is very, I'll say SQL-like in the way that it's structured. However, it is very, very powerful in what you can do with it, whether it be cross table joins, whether it be cross workspaces, etc. You have the capability to do that. And the cool thing about this is that there is actually a free course on Pluralsight. It's about 4 to 5 hours, but it is well worth investing the time. So if this is an area you want to look at, then I'd certainly recommend looking at that. So, and there's some extra links on that. So while I just swap around this time, so let me just stop sharing, do what Graham did a little bit earlier, and let me share. Right. Just bear with me a second. Okay, now hopefully this comes through and you don't have a black screen. So could somebody possibly give me a visual check, please?
It's thinking about it, Paul. Still, yeah, we're good.
Right, okay. So if you're familiar with the Azure Portal, you can get to Sentinel by typing in Sentinel, and I've done a recent search already. So once you get to the Azure Sentinel part of this, you can go through the process of either creating a new Sentinel environment, which in effect relies on a log analytics workspace to store your data. So when we build up that picture, we start with the Azure Sentinel we start with the log analytics workspace. We then attach Sentinel to that, and then after that, it's down to the actual configuration of Sentinel itself. So what you end up finding is that actually the provisioning part of it is done in about 10 or 15 minutes. Where it takes a little bit longer is about the data connections, maybe looking at your RBAC model, etc. But essentially, you know, we'll come in and you effectively get to this overview screen. Now, I tend to start with the news and guides, and the reason for that is not because it's you know, a bit cheesy or anything like that, but actually there's quite useful information here. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's actually a link to the Ninja training that I was mentioning earlier. But also what the product team are doing is actually utilizing it as a way to advertise latest things that we've put in there. Yes, there's the, you know, the tech community blog site that's available that does a lot of these, but equally, if you haven't familiar with that and you've not gone there for a while, chances are you can get to see what you need to see from the news and guides here. And it's really, really useful places. Configuration starts with data connectors, and I mentioned that there's like 90 odd of them here. Now, I will mention that some of these connectors are in preview. All that means is that some of the capability they've been recently announced, and they've been made available purely on the basis that we're now getting to that point where we're looking at scale testing. You know, so and then the next question is generally, when's it going to be available? The answer is when it's ready is the simple. I know it's a bit of a flippant answer, but that's generally the case. What I've found in the past is that I will be demoing one day and I'll have a connector that's in preview, and the following day it's then gone into general availability. Although that said, the product team are trying to do them more in semesters, so in sort of quarterly and time frames where they will release a few and get them into, you know, out of preview and into be generally available at the same time if they can. As you can see, there's a, you know, from a provider's perspective, it's not just Microsoft. We have a plethora of third parties in there, and this list is going to grow. And this is the list I was referring to earlier, whereby actually, you know, they've committed to delivering so much more. I'm just going to pick up on one at the moment, so I'll pick up on the Azure Active Directory. I mentioned about the connector page. So over here on the right-hand side, on this kind of you know, summary screen, you basically see what the data flow is like inbound, and based on the criteria or category of log that we're bringing in. So you can see from AAD's perspective, we're bringing in sign-in logs, audit logs, and the other ones that we've enabled in there with maybe the non-interactive logins and sign-ins, etc. What you will also note as part of these is that there's also related content. The related content is coming back to what I was mentioning earlier. There's the workbooks for visualization. There's some sample queries. They're not a complete list, but they're a good place to start. The other part of it, which is probably the most important part, is the analytic rule templates. Those are the out-of-the-box rules that you can enable to start interrogating and analyzing the security data that's coming into your particular environment. And those are based on the KQL. So if I click through on that particular, we can see the list that's down here, and it's I'll just let it come through and give it a moment. But essentially, what you have with these analytic rules is that if we look at this one here, for example, which is the MFA disabled for a user, that could be based on, you know, that we want to identify that. If we've enabled MFA across the board, we want to identify and in effect alert on the basis that maybe it's been disabled for a particular user. Is that an indicator of credential access? It may or may not be, but that's the rule that we will utilize to actually interrogate the data that's coming from AAD to identify that particular scenario. When those rules are enabled and when the criteria is met, it will then, I just cancel that, it will appear in the incidents node. The incidents is a case of the rule has been met and we will now identify. So if I'm the you know, a SOC analyst, this is probably where I'm going to spend my day, is going through these, and I could individual alerts in and of by themselves. So if I pick on this one about potential password spray, I'm actually going to go straight to the view full details, just so it gives me a bit more information here. What you will see is there's a number of different data points on this particular view. We've got a description. We've got the evidence that we've got there, so we can see there's a number of events, the alert that's associated with it, when it was when it was updated, and when it was created. It will also identify any entities that are associated there. So thinking about a password spray, it's probably picking a list of user accounts. It's probably doing something like a dictionary, search. Can it identify those? So, and what it's doing behind the scenes is picking up on those, accounts and identifying and marking them. When you look at the detail over here on the right-hand side, we can see severity, whatever else. The important thing that I want to highlight is, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the view the playbooks shortcut that's there. That would take me to the list of playbooks that are Logic playbook that evoke in reaction to this particular incident. On the analytic rules, just to double back on the analytic rules, if I want to, I can add so it will automatically remediate a particular scenario. But we need to look at those and identify those up front and configuration. One thing I will mention as part of these is that each of these incidents will map, as you can see, the tactics here. It's looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So when we think about both the, we're thinking of it on the basis of our hunt rules. So think of instances almost, I don't want to say it is to a certain extent reactive, whereas the hunting side of it is I'm being proactive. I am looking for particular indicators. Now we do have a number of rules. Again, there's 200 odd of them in here that are there that you can enable effectively to allow you to hunt through that data set. Very small minor point, but it's quite neat in a way, is that if I favorite any of those, what it does is when I come to this hunting view, it'll automatically run that particular query for me. So that's why I've got results here of this rare audit activity for initiated by a user. Again, I can go down, I can drill down into this, and if I was going to, it would literally take me down into the raw data in the log analytics workspace. And you can see at the top here, about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, how many of those rules are based on each of the individual tactics that are associated there. One thing I would say, just looking at time and thinking about this, is that it is always changing. So, we've got in the threat intelligence, you can bring your own threat intelligence. So if you're familiar with things like sticks and taxi data sources, for example, you can bring those in and supplement what is already there with your existing data sets. One thing that's also really, really useful is things like watch lists. Most of you will probably be familiar with the concept of VIP type users. Well, you can use it, or even, really important machines, quote unquote, is you can create those watch lists, and effectively based on that watch list, you can use it in a query and say, right, I want you to keep an eye out for any sort of data that's related to this particular, this group or this individual or, list of individuals within the data. So that's kind of really, really, really important. The last thing I'm going to show is kind of the side of things. So this is where we're starting to look at individual users within your tenant or tenants and what their interaction is. So I'm going to pick up on Chris here. And so what you can see, look at an individual user. What it's doing is it's not only giving me information about him as an individual, it's also giving me an idea of the events and alerts over time. And then further down here, I can actually look at each of the events that are associated with. So we can see maybe there's a suspicious granting permissions to an account, and it allows, so it gives me timeline, but then I can drill down into that, and I've done this now. So now what it's done is taking me down into the raw data behind all of this, and it will build a query and it'll return the results set. What's really cool here is that once the data comes back, I have the option to then create another rule off the back of that if appropriate. Actually, the customer is quite big on that. Apologies, it's taking a bit of time. I'm actually just going to go straight back because that's just taking a bit. Oh, there we go. That's come through. So we can see that is a suspicious activity. What I can do, and I didn't show this a little bit earlier, is if I want to, I can actually bookmark this. What that means is if I've looked at a particular result set, for example, and I think there's something else that it might be warrant somebody else having a look at it, by bookmarking it, I could then come back to the Sentinel UI. I can then go to hunting, and if I look at the bookmarks here, I can then look at that particular rule set. So what it means is that just because I'm looking at something and I may need a second opinion, by bookmarking it, somebody else can come along and therefore then can pick up on one of these, and you can see then a bit more of the detail, and they can start to analyze that and maybe do some additional work on it. What I will say, just as a final thing, looking at the time, and I'm running 2 minutes over now, is that there is a massive community behind all of this. Behind this view here is actually an Azure GitHub repo. And within the repo itself, what has been built, and this is a curated repo, is, additional data connectors, additional detections, queries, whether they be hunting or exploration queries, playbooks, parsers. So if you're familiar with Sysmon, for example, you might want to parse the data before you send it in. So there's a wealth of knowledge and additional capability that you can bring into and sort of leverage as part of that, your Azure Sentinel deployment. On that note, I will park it there. But any questions? But please feel free to ask them.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for going through that. Really interesting. I've actually got a question or two, if that's okay.
Fine. Yeah.
So why not? The first one that I've got is quite a generic question, really, and that's what are the most wanted connectors, as well as also what's kind of under development. What can we kind of see coming through in the future from a connector perspective?
Yeah, so the connectors themselves, it varies. So obviously from Microsoft's perspective, we're going to develop and add additional connectors or evolve the connectors that we have. So an example I'll give you, when we released the Office 365 one, for example, it had it had Exchange and SharePoint. And then they've added Teams to that. So the connectors always evolve. The biggest growth area in connectors is third parties. And that's because most organizations have utilize maybe best of breed type scenarios when they're thinking about how they're protecting their environments, whether it be at the perimeter or even internal to that. So that's where the area of focus is. And it varies. There's, most of the, shall I say, the major players are covered. But equally, if I was to look at Cisco as an example, we started out with the ASAs, but they've added more. So if you're familiar with Umbrella, for example, that's come in, and I think that particular connector is in preview. And that's how it'll evolve. It's mostly based on demand, but the bigger vendors will be, dealt with first. Another example I had earlier this week was, and I don't know if anybody's come across it, using 2FIN for sort of network policy management and orchestration. I've had 2 queries this week about that one in particular. So, talking to the product team themselves and say, right, what we want you to do is a feedback form. Let's fill in the feedback form. And then what they do is utilize that as kind of a prioritization of where to focus their energies. Because obviously, like a lot of places, they've got a finite amount of resources. And it's about, you've probably looked at these things on user voice, for example, where you've got, your vote up button. They do make a big difference about where they focus their energies.
Oh, that's good to know. Thanks for that. If there was one piece of advice that you would give when using Sentinel, what would it be?
2 things, probably. 1, look at your data retention, and 2, start to think about your long-term storage of it. The reason for that is most organizations when they run on-premise SIEMs, they don't really think about that per se, because they just assume they'll just have, they'll work out the storage of the back end and what they're going to do with it. From a Sentinel perspective, there's a cost associated with retaining that data for any period of time up to 2 years. And that's where potentially it can become expensive. So looking at the longer term storage of that. So, this is where my role starts to blur a little bit into the area where Graham lives a lot of the time, is in starting to look at, things like data lakes, So that's probably the areas to think about when you're looking at Sentinel, is that the operational and using it is fine, but actually think about the longer term piece as well. So that would be when you think about the patterns.
Would that long-term piece kind of relate to what a company would determine to be a good time to keep data for, and like data retention and things like that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So most patterns these days, that we're starting to see more from the conversation is coming up. We'd always say, initially would say, you can store it in the workspace up for 2 years, right? But beyond 2 years, if you needed to that, the option was stick it into an Azure storage account. That is fine. But where it becomes a challenge sometimes is then if you want to query that data and just the way the queries are built. Yes, we can reference it, but actually the query becomes really complex because of the way the data is stored in the storage account. So what we're starting to see is that we're starting to use Azure Data Explorer as a kind of a way of doing that. So by taking the Sentinel data and storing it, say, in the workspace for 90 days and actually doing a dual write into an ADX cluster, I could then write a query against the 90-day window and then use the same query against the longer, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5-year window, using that. So that becomes a lot easier to do it. So that's where we're starting to see a lot more conversations about is people want hot at 90 days is generally fine, but it's the hunting side of it, more the forensics that they want for longer term.
That's really interesting. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I can see where that could make a difference for, especially when depending on the types of organizations you're dealing with, can make a big difference there.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about, Graham and I work in the same team, so we're pretty much in finance and cap markets. And I like Graham, I kind of touch my toe in the other sectors as well. But you're right, is that certain organizations in certain sectors will have different views on how long they need to retain the data for, and it's therefore then what's the best way of doing it. And when you think about it, at the same time we want to make it efficient, both from an operational perspective, but also from a cost scenario. And that's then where, we're starting to look at how do we blend between, the technologies and the services.
Yeah, there's definitely always a trade-off when it comes to, long-term retention. You have to think about those storage technologies, which, as you quite rightly say, Graham, has a massive part in. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any other. One of the other questions that I did have was around the visualization side of things. So going in and using Sentinel, you can see the visualization of things and attacks that are happening. Is that possible to view outside?
Do you mean the investigation graph where I can join all the dots or whatever else? No, that's internal to Sentinel, and that's because what it's did. That's where the internal. That's where the AI and the machine learning is working, because what it's doing is it's looking at that data set and it's joining the dots, to use the analogy, and keeping the relationship. So when you look at that investigation graph, if for example, where we had, when I looked at Jeff from a UEBA scenario, so if we'd identified a credential access, for example, against his account or other accounts, what you do from there is it then can either link to other alerts associated with that or events linked to that again, so where it might have been used somewhere else. And that's, so the visualization element is as much to do with the data that's beneath it as opposed to what you see. It's just an easier way, because the queries that's built behind it is what brings it forward.
That makes sense. I don't think we've got any further questions.